go ahead and get started. Everybody get some dinner ready. Thank you for being here. I appreciate you taking the time to participate in this update and hear what's going on. So tonight, I want to talk to you a little bit about our efforts and what we're working to do to sort of take control of our commitment to increasing wages for our DSPs. And what goes into that, what's a little bit about the history about that, and some of the things that we're considering to make that happen. Do I have to go like this? Okay. Really, in order to do that, I have to take a little bit of time and go back and give you a little history on what makes up our rates. How do we decide what are the information that we have to address wages and how that works? So it's going to take just a little bit of our time today just to go back in time a little bit. So prior to 2007, when PCL first started, and for many, many years after that, individual rates were developed through negotiations. So teams would get together and say, this is what this person's needs are, these are their needs, this is about how much staffing we think they need, and here's a budget, and we would work with counties to do that. Some people's rates came from Fairview closure. So when Fairview closed, they set certain amount of rates for certain levels of staffing patterns. There's other earlier projects, like there's Project 888, earlier projects along where, and what happened is each time, as time went on and community life was being built for people with disabilities, how they calculated the funding that they gave people changed, right? So that was sort of prior to that. And they had come up with here's about an average wage of what DSPs are paid, and then that was the driver for those rates, right? Then in 2007, it was decided in order to create some balance in that, they entered into the rate restructuring process, which was titled Rebar, right? So in the rate restructuring process, they had a couple goals. The ultimate goal of rate restructuring was to balance rates. It was to bring up low rates to manage with, so that people could predictably know what funding was. So for a family member or someone who experiences disabilities, if I have these needs, I can get the resources and the supports I need no matter where I go, and the funding will be the same. Whether I live in Eastern Oregon or I live in Portland, where I'm supported by PCL or I'm supported by New Hope or something that's over in Eastern Oregon. So that was really the goal of that, and what they did was they did rate study, they did cost surveys to providers, they checked on sort of what the average thing they were paying people, and then they created a rate structure for that. There was a stakeholder group that was part of that, but the ultimate outcome is the tier system we have today. So I don't really like to talk about people by a tier, so I'll try to not do that today. It's not really what we do. But how their supports are defined are really based on sort of their tier allocation. So what has an assessment that's developed, a consistent assessment across the state, said results in what their needs are. Okay? So our tier system right now for DD50, and DD50 is 24-hour supports. So if you are supporting somebody who works at a home that's licensed by the 24-hour rule, I'm talking about that section of the service we do only today, okay? As far as that history. So there's tiers 1 through 6. That's the tier level someone's assignment could be. And then if they have exceptional needs, either medical or extra support for other challenges, then there's a process called tier 7 that allows for a little bit higher rate. So I kind of went through that. The other thing that was developed in the rebar process that I've probably showed you if you've been around for a while and you've come to these trainings before, I pulled them up and showed you how they calculated rates. They developed not necessarily the same kind of structured tier process, but they create a budget format for supported living. So there's an assessment that's done, that's put into a budget tool, like the number of hours, and then all the other drivers in there are sort of set. So the number of hours is where the fluctuation is. And then that was the same way up until recently that they managed supported living. There's two big drivers to the funding that we receive for somebody. There's sort of the standard drivers, but the major drivers are really the number of hours are allocated in their budget for service and whatever the staffing costs associated with that. Probably 3 of you include admin. So that was 2007. And then kind of what's happened next through that over the last 10 years, there has been sort of ebbs and flows and changes to that funding. Oftentimes, our funding doesn't see your typical cost of living increase. There's been 2 efforts really where we've done significant advocacy. Well, there's advocacy every session, but we've had sort of a couple successful efforts around significant advocacy around increasing rates for DSPs, right? So we participated in all kinds of different efforts and done that. Basically using the information that we gleaned from, so how do we know what the state funds on average our wages on the DSPs, is we've used the information that many of us understood after the rebar process, because that's kind of what was shared with us, mostly because that's the number that they use to calculate Tier 7. So Tier 7 means they add hours on top, and they only fund staffing hours within the Tier 7. So the 1080 was where that number came from, was from there. And then that's the number that's used in supported living, and that was numbers that was used in the voc rate models. So that's really where that came from, and all of our advocacy efforts since then have used that number as our information, okay? So, there's a couple of reasons that sort of solidify that and kind of reinforce that. We generated outcome reports to the state, turnover reports, where they collected data on what the average wage were across the state, and most providers consistently using that information that we budget with was that number. And there's the other sort of practical piece of that. That's really what worked in the budgets, right? There wasn't a lot of excess funding, at least for us and most of my peers. So that seemed like there was all those reasons that sort of validated and supported that information that we were working with. So really then we decided, as time went on though, those rates and that thing didn't really increase fast enough, and other things were changing. The economy changed, the market changed, and so our divide and our ability to pay really good competitive wages really pushed us into a state where we feel like we were going into crisis. Right. So we started working with the state and saying we have to figure out how to address those DSP wages. We have to move that up. Showing that really providers are at a crisis point because we've done all we can with those rates not changing. So this little graph here I added in here to show you. If you look at this blue line here, this blue line is from the last like 9 years. What's happened to wages at PCL? What have we done in relation to what we're funding and paying for DSP wages? So our wages have gone up from about 25%. It's 24.72 specifically. Okay. This little yellow line is CPI, is the Consumer Price Index, just saying what's happened to the economy, what's changed around those. And so that's gone up by about 12%. But this red line here shows what's happened to the funding to support that, right? So basically the question is, you guys just keep doing it. Why is it now a crisis, right? Well, we've kept doing it as long as we can, without support on those resources. And that's really how we found ourselves in these last several years in our current funding crisis. Right. So 2015, we said it's time for even more action on that, and we generated the Raise the Wage campaign. Good things came out of that. That's where the 4% came from that you just saw in that last little leap of wages. It really brought the issue of DSP wages to the forefront, to the discussion. Our legislators understand this issue. DHS, and the Office of Developmental Disabilities is acknowledging, you're right, this is a significant issue. Your systems and this system's important, that we have a good structure, that people supported, and these services deserve those good wages, and people who make them. We did the price of compassion video that's sort of out there nationally. And it really pushed us to moving this from not just raise the wage, that it's really more about wages, although fundamentally that's what our effort, but this whole discussion has resulted in a system in crisis, right? That we won't be sustainable if we can't have a strong workforce. So that's a little bit about the history. Keep moving to the next slide. Right. So once again, we got together and because of all those other efforts and all along the way, we had really a partnership with the Office of Developmental Disabilities, the DD Coalition, provider organizations, the ORA, got together and really said we have to seriously affect that and make this happen, which led to a discussion, well, we've got to figure out how to get numbers to take to legislators. In order to get numbers to take to legislators, we have to dig deeper into that rebar rate tool so that we can tell them exactly what it would cost. So we're saying we think we need a wage of $16 an hour, for example. That should be our average wage. We have to tell legislators, what will it cost you to do that, which led to this sort of deeper dive. And so here's what we found when we got into more details on the rate wall. And it's complicated, so, well, it's complicated, right? Because there's lots of layers of this. But what the division state came back and said to us is, well, this is what we can do, and we're not really sure, but according to the data we have in the rebar model, the hourly wage that we budget on average for a DSP is $13.45, and that's after the 4%. So one of the reasons we're having this conversation today, one, is to help you understand where we're at and where we're going, and to share with you what we've learned, but also because we have really, as an organization, we pride ourselves on transparency and being straight with you about what we're working with and what the budget is. And I've been having this conversation with many of you who've been around for a while, for years, right? And I've pulled up the website and showed you how a budget's made for supported living and showed you that line that says 1080. And so I want you to see this as well, right? So that's part of it. Part of it's just, this is what they're saying. The rate in our, in that line is $13.45. And then also there was information in there about the budgeted hours, and we'll get to that in just a minute, right? So kind of what, can you go back to that last slide for a second? So really, what was our response? First of all, we kind of like freaked out a little bit, just a little bit. Like, this can't be true. How can this be the facts, right? And it's why this isn't important is it's the number that would go to legislators to increase wages. So it has to be accurate. And we had lots of going around about it and really sat down and looked through those facts and looked right there on the piece of paper, sort of there it is. Then, if that's true, then we also then had to look at ourselves and say, then why aren't we doing it? Why can't we have an average wage of $13.45? If that's what's in the rebar model, it should work, right? I should be able to take a budget that we currently have at one of the places you support people, take our average weight in, put this average weight in, and I should be able to fund that site. And we can't. I mean, that simple was the first exercise. Like the first thing to say, how come we're here? That was my first exercise. So the next is to really dig deeper. So we decided we had to look at some data and dig deeper to figure out what's the problem. You know, how are these two things not working? Which one thing is not like the other? Right? So you can go this way. And here's what we found. This is just a little bit of data for you. Okay? What we found in digging through this, now our average wage varies because it depends on how many people leave and if a long-term person leaves and all that sort of stuff, right? But our current average wage is $11.41 an hour. Okay. Why we talk about average wage in all these discussions is because it's a budget number, right? And even when the legislators give us funding and say, even if they were to fund it that way, which they don't usually fund by wage, when they pull them out, it's not that's everyone's wage. It has to be average that allows for us to build a wage scale that will support retention, right? That will keep people want to stay. So I have to be able to, I don't want to cap them. I have to be able to say, we can fund things and let a long-term employee who we have now who make $18 an hour, you know, and still not bust the budget, right? Actually, and we always sort of joke, we would love to have that problem. Right, that we have so many long-term employees, we have to figure out how to make that average wage work because it's going to go up and go up and go up. But we currently don't. So our average wage is $11.41. An average overtime wage is about $18.44 an hour. When people are working overtime, on average, they're making about that. And so if you sort of calculate that on what's our per hour cost for a DSP, and these are rough estimates. Really, if you calculate the number of overtime hours that are in there, it's about $15 an hour, right? So that explains a little bit of it, right? That explains why that average wage in the budget is, and what's operationally happening. That sort of just leads you to a chicken or the egg discussion though, right? Okay, so, yeah, of course that's how it is now, but if the wage was this, maybe that wouldn't happen, right? So you have to It doesn't necessarily really answer the question for us, or it certainly didn't satisfy us to really be able to understand how we got here. I mean, that's part of it, but not all of it. So we had to go to the next step, right? If it's not that, then what, right? That's a contributing factor, I would say, but it's not really the sort of the root cause. And then here's really where we sort of rolled in. I kind of already went through all this. We can skip this slide, right? So this is really where we started finding and looking into where the issues are. So we went to the other main driver, right? There's probably three. There's administrative costs, which is also a main driver, but that's usually an amount that you kind of stay within in the budget. It doesn't vary. So we looked at the hours. So in the rebar rate tool, each tier has an assigned number of hours to it. So if I am, for example, I'm going to use somebody who has a tier 6 assessment, which is that someone who needs quite a bit of support, right? They, in their budget, so one of the drivers used to calculate that end result on that rate, are funded for about 13 hours a day. Okay. And then you take that and you add that with the other 3 people live there. This is best case scenario, since not everyone we support lives with 3 other people, but we're using that model because that's what it's based on. The other issues would be our decisions. Then you have about 40 hours a day to provide staffing for that person, right? Which gives you enough, if you roll that up to FTE, what that means is that our staffing patterns really across the board in those places should be no more than 1 staff for 3 people with some floating time for each person to get about 5 hours a day of time, one-on-one services, or a second person, right? So that's kind of that's what those staffing patterns should be if that was reality, right? So that's what they were based on. That's information that was new and different to us. So we took those numbers, just generally not thinking that I was going to find any problems. We took those numbers and we just did sort of this big review first, right? We have 3 people. This is the number of people we support. So we have 28 people who have tier 6 funding. We added on how many hours does that mean? So totally 364 hours, and how many they're getting. And what that really showed us was that we are providing about 35%, or I'm rounding up, it's 34.99, I don't want to exaggerate, to more staffing than supports than we're funded for, right? And then, so that sort of, that was an eye-opener, right? And I'm not suggesting than is needed, I'm saying than what we're funded for, okay? Which is really, again, really contributing to where these numbers are off. Let's go to the next slide. So what does that mean if you take that, and I'm going to explain how this drills down a little bit in a second, but what does that mean if you have, that's 535 hours a day approximately that we're providing hours for. You times that by our current average wage, not the $15 an hour, mind you, because I'm not doing the chicken or the egg here. I'm saying here it is. If we were there, I'm timesing it by that. We're spending approximately $6,000 per day on staffing above what we're funded for, which comes to 2.2 million-ish per year. So just for fun, I thought, well, what would it take me to do a $2 an hour raise increase? Because that's about the difference between the rebar model and what we're paying according to those wages. So I thought, so what would it take? How much would it cost me? So it's a little bit more than that, but ironically, it's $2.4 million. So that explains the variance on that wage. Is that making sense? Right? So we kind of really went into this, honestly, not with a lot of hypothesis because we were trying to figure it out and sort of built them as we went. And then that last P really solidified, okay, so there it is. So there it is, and if that's the case, now what? We have to think about a plan of action. What could we do with this information? So on the short-term solution is if we reduce the number of hours, or if we align the hours that we're providing supports as close as possible to the hours that are in the funded thing, then we can redirect those funds to wages. We can make that wage increase and not wait for this problem to be fixed by somebody else. Right? that's why I said this is about us taking control on that. I want to, before I kind of follow up on that, I want to show you this sort of next slide. So, did you take the one? No, never mind. Go back to the next one. I'll come back. I think I rearranged it. So, having said that, I want to make sure that you all sort of let's listen all the way through before we jump to any conclusions around what that means. Okay. Here's how I feel about this. Yesterday I was in Southern Oregon talking to our Southern Oregon team about this, and I said, you know, remember anybody here remember Susan Powers, the woman with the white hair who used to scream, "Well, stop the madness," right? That's that's kind of how I feel about this. I feel like we have to stop the madness, right? That if we can slow ourselves down for a bit, figure out how to circle the wagons, figure out how to at least do something. I don't think $2 an hour is enough, but to do something to move our wages ahead, to provide stability and long-term support, you know, even if it means some other compromises, then we're going to be ahead of the game for the future. If that happens, other costs are reduced, right? So if we're not hiring 35 people a month because we're able to fill positions, we save hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on training costs, right? Which could be then looked at to enhance those staffing patterns back up again if we felt like we needed them. Or it could be further put to wages. All those things. So these were all kind of the thoughts that came to head when we said, how are we going to manage this? How are we going to control this without saying we're waiting for somebody else to fix it? We're going to wait for more help later, but this is really about a short-term immediate response. You can go to the next slide. Thanks, Lori. So, as we move forward with some of these discussions, what were the kind of things that we, our executive team, sort of talked to ourselves about with this that we want to make sure are in place, and we want to share them with you, right? That our first priority is going to be about health and safety of the people we support, right? I want to think about, I'm asking you here today really to be prepared to think about how can we align those hours closer to what we're funded for, like I said, even if on the short term, but we don't want to do it at the expense of jeopardizing health and safety for the people we support. So that was important to us. The other factor just to throw in here is I'm not even addressing the complicated issues that come with people who receive Tier 7 funding. We have another little graph that I can show you that those numbers are even way farther off than right. That's about $100,000 per month of unfunded hours there. And we are dealing with that in another arena. Even with the challenges, you know, increased wages, even the challenges doing this is what I want you to consider. That might come with aligning those hours differently and looking at things differently. If we provide staff stability, it will enhance people's lives. Right? If we have, people cannot be having a churn of people coming through the door. If you all weren't having to work tons and tons of overtime to make things work, people are gonna get better supports. Right? So it's balancing those. And then the other little bit of information to remember as we have these conversations is in our funding, there is not, unless somebody has a Tier 7, there isn't any of the funding structure that allows for one-to-one supports in DD50. None. And we've sort of created these ideas about that. But there isn't any funding that really supports that. Right? So, in order to meet this board directive, that's what we're here to talk about. We want to figure out how we can align those hours so that we can increase wages, and that will provide stability, again, which less staffings will be hiring less people. It's my little repeat this cycle. I think this could be the beginning of a way for us to really shore up some of those funding things and save funds in many other places. So this is just a complicated thing here, but the reason I wanted to show you this to you, in the first couple of conversations we've talked, the leadership team has had this discussion, in my conversations with our Southern Oregon team, it's a little confusing. So when I said we're about 35% off, the first thing that went into each of the people's that I'm talking to's mind is, we can never operate without 35% staff with the person I work with 35% less staff, right? So I want to clarify, that's a total. That 35% number was agency-wide averaged. The numbers, what we actually have is, and in all the data associated with this, and I took the names off so people don't stress, but we actually took every single place we provide service, figured out how many hours are in the funding that they receive, how many hours provided, and what our difference is. You can't really see very well on here, the red and the black. Many of these are red, the ones with parentheses. So you'll see some places it's like 5 hours a day, right? That's it. In some places it's 26 hours a day, right? You can't, I know we can't take 26 hours a day out of somebody's staffing supports and keep people healthy and safe, right? I mean, I don't think we can, maybe. But, so it's not about, it's not an across, this is not an across the board discussion. It's not like a pin that we want to thing and say, okay, realign, move all this here and do something over here. It's going to be an individual team by team discussion around how can we make this happen? Is this possible? Etc. Is that making sense? Okay. So, does anyone have any questions? I should stop because I'm about to move out of the numbers piece and sort of just talking about ideas. No? Are you? All right, good. So,
Joanne,
Jay, yes.
really quick question. I know we're speaking just about our organization. Can you tell us what other providers in the state are experiencing related to this? Are they experiencing the same things, and do they even know that they are?
We have shared this information with the Oregon Resource Association, which is our provider association, that you will often hear me talk about, that does most of the lobbying in the state around our wages and things, and helps address those issues. We've shared this, and I can anecdotally tell you that, yes, the Tier 7 is a statewide issue. I mean, that's just how it is. How we create staffing complements and staffing patterns could very well just be a PCL issue, but in the conversations that I've had with my peers, it's not. You know, that they are looking at these numbers and saying the same thing, and they're filling out. We've shared this template with them, and they're all filling it out so we could come together and show, here's the issue across the board of the state. So, again, here's some things that, as we talk about these next steps and what we want to roll out here, is one, we're going to be person-centered. We don't want anyone to be left without vital supports. Okay. To be honest with you, reducing staffing patterns could change what happens for people on a day-to-day basis, but we don't want anybody to be left without and not in a place where they're healthy and safe. If we roll out this realignment of hours, we would never, again, this is not about making a change tomorrow across the agency and have it done in 2 weeks. This is going to be a process that will take time and take discussion and roll out over time. Right? We still need to collect input from you. That's why we're here today. We want to talk to staff about this. We need to talk to families about this. We need to talk to Spark. I need to go to, I want to talk to the people we support about this. I mean, this is sort of all of us going to have to be all in this together. And this is step one. So please don't leave here today and feel like, well, everything's changing tomorrow. This is step one. And collecting data, what we want to do from this is create a rollout plan with really specific steps and what would the ongoing information be like? How we would share that, okay? All right. What's that? Do you have a question? Okay. So here's some information about our commitment as we have this conversation and how we'll move forward, okay? As always, our commitment is that we'll be person-centered with this. Not only person-centered ultimately about the people we support, and also about our team members, right? That we're communicating and you're involved in that process, right? In order for this to work, I have a little handout that we'll share with you and kind of pass around. Here, we can pass it around. We have to go on, to make this plan, we need a plan that will go all in, right? This is not about budget cutting, right? Even I am trying to correct myself when not using that language. I am purposely talking about realignment, not cuts, right? Because a cut means we reduce that money and it just goes somewhere else. It goes to our bottom line, right? Which we could use some help there too. But that's not the effort of this exercise and this discussion. It's about moving one cost from here to wages, right? And we all kind of have to go in on that. Right? As we move through this discussion, it's about building capacities, right? Making sure that We know what skills it's gonna take to do it. We have people in the right place, people doing the right job. Somebody yesterday in Southern Oregon said, one of the discussions that they had was, could we have somebody who kind of floats around and helps with things that, because sometimes we have staff here just in case, right? Is there somebody who could float around that we can call just in case? They might be here and they might be there. Like, well, that's a really good idea. And then another staff says, well, I would hate that job and never want to do it, and now you're going to lose me. I said, well, then we wouldn't ask you to do that job, right? So, I didn't say that. We were joking. Joking, Southern Oregon. Okay? I mean, it actually was an excellent question. It was a really good discussion, and it really leads to this particular statement. You know, there are people who would love that job, and then there are people who would not. So as you move forward thinking about creatively looking at things, we have to look at people's capacity and say, right match, right people, right place. Remember, we are a learning culture, okay? That's one of our fundamental values about ongoing learning. And what often happens in crisis and in change, and I know I say this a lot because there's a lot of crisis and change, right, is we learn something new. And sometimes we figure out ways that we say, gosh, I wish I would have been doing that forever. Why didn't we think of that before? Well, the time wasn't right. Now it is. So. And that we want to lead through this process inclusively, okay? And these came from a PowerPoint, and I gave, if you ever want to, I mean, from a TED Talk, there's a resource on there if you want to watch it. But it was just a good reminder about how you lead through transition. And these values were so consistent with our playbook, and our values, you know, that's where we went. We, you know, again, it's important to us that we're transparent with you, that we share with you how things are going. But often, sometimes, we have to remember we get things started, and then we get going busy, we get going every day, and we forget, right? We forget to keep everybody informed. We forget to keep that conversation going. You know, so as we move through this discussion, our commitment is that we'll keep that, we will work on that, keeping that going. So we really want to be transparent. So, again, we're going to have time for some conversation in a minute. But remember, there's more to come, okay? There are still many efforts in play to address the overall issue of wages. This is not a legislative activity I'm talking about right here, or the advocacy that we're doing in other areas. This is, again, sort of me jumping on the stage if I had short white hair saying we got to figure out how to stop this madness, right? We have to figure out how to move ourselves forward and support people well. But there is still legislative activity, and we'll be calling on you for that, okay? There's all that's happening. We're just jumping into session, and there's lots of work going on. There is a policy option package out there that includes a 4% rate increase that can be used, no, actually, I think it might be 7, that we could use towards wages. There is ORA has sponsored a bill that talks about what they have to fund the wages at. So there's lots of work to do that. So that has not stopped. I talked about the pot. And we are actively working on the issues that Shay's talked about, of making sure we're working together with our peers around how we address those issues with some of the most, the people that we support who really need that level of support and have some of those challenges. How do we continue to make sure we can do that well? Okay. So what now? I'm doing this. We're talking to you. We want to use the data that we have to kind of think how we would move forward. So that little chart I showed you that showed each site with the number of hours, like how do we go place by place and say, is there any room here? Is there a way we could be more creative? Could we be doing this differently? We want to implement some small pilot projects that will give you some more information on that as we get it rolling. Not just on looking at the number and saying, oh, can we move some of this around? But have some groups who really want to get together and talk about, can we just think really differently about supports? Think really differently about how we do this. Does everything always have to be the same? You know, how would that work? So there's a couple groups that work on that, and we'll share with you as we get more detail on that. So as we move forward after tonight, I have another forum tomorrow, and we'll sort of try to get information out to everybody. You know, watch your Gmail, and we'll stay informed. This is being videotaped, which I'm thrilled about, really. And so that we can send it out on Gmail for your teammates who aren't here who can see it. So we can all be on the same page, right? So we'll be sending that out. And I've been to Southern Oregon. And then in February and March, I have another series of discussions for us to have that I hope you'll come back to sort of say, okay, now we've listened, we've gathered some information. here's some ideas of things that could be moving forward. And at that time, I think you go to the next slide, Lloyd. And at that time, we will have a more specific rollout plan. So our intention with that rollout plan is to say, here's our discussions we've had, here's some ideas, and now how we're gonna check on it, with some benchmarks in there that you can hold us accountable. So so if we do this, if we are able to realign some hours, that we're back here in May and saying, okay, we've realigned some hours, here's what it looks like that we've been able to reassign, and how will we convert that into wages? Right, this is not gonna be tomorrow, I can magically do a $2 an hour increase, because it's gonna happen increments, which is why we have to have check-ins with you to say, okay, here's what we've done. This money's been reallocated here, that's matching in our performance, so now we can do this much, right? And then we'll come back in September, or July. I don't know what those dates are yet, because we don't know how fast that will roll out, but we've come out, try to thinking that we can look at things about every 3 months, and say, what's happening, and what does that mean for meeting our commitment to you, that we're gonna use those funds to realign things. Okay. So some parting thoughts, not parting thoughts, but parting on this part thoughts, right? Again, don't panic. This is just the beginning of the discussion. Okay. This is, if you have questions, ask. If you have ideas, share, all right? So it is natural human nature for us to kvetch a little bit with our peers about things we don't like, right? And that's natural, and I understand that. But if you can think about it in that moment, how to turn that into ideas, or say, let's make sure people know about our thoughts about that, right? Let somebody know. So you have my email. I know people have my email. I get all the time, right? You have Zelly's email. So send us your thoughts, your ideas, your comments. You know, you want to be passionate, use all caps. That's okay. I don't care. But let's use some communication to get that information out. Here we have. Right? And this is not about anybody losing their job, okay? This is another why I purposely want to think about this about realignment. This is not, we need to cut 25 positions. That's silly. We need every single one of you to stay here forever. Okay? And ever. So, it's not about that. It's about figuring out how we can pay you better to stay here forever. All right? And just a little bit for those of you who've been around a long time, we have done these things before, right? We have come together, we've circled our wagons for a short period of time and said, we're gonna focus on infrastructure. We're gonna, drill down a little bit to make these sort of things happen. We've been through crises other crises that really we didn't have as much control of. What's different about this, I think, is we're trying to take control of it ourselves. We're trying to use the data that we have and just hold on to those reins and say, we're gonna fix this as much as we can, all right? And just for a little hope for your future is, change is constant, and it's going to be, and it's just who we are. I used to believe that someday that we would operate in a climate where everything was fixed and stayed the same. I mean, I was only gonna do this for 5 years, because I was gonna solve the world's problems in 5 years. It's 30 years later, and I'm still here, okay? That was my original plan. It's gonna be perfect in 5 years, and I'll pass it off. It's not gonna happen. It's gonna always be great. It's always gonna be growing, and it's not a bad thing, right? Change means that we're growing and learning and trying to be better. Okay. So, one more. We really need your help in this process, okay? And clear, positive communication is important. So we have to think about how we talk about this, okay? It's the people we support have enough anxiety in their life, right? That sharing this discussion about, we're changing things without really having any facts will just cause stress for people. Talking to people's families when we're just trying to start a conversation with you so that we can learn and think will just cause stress. It's not a secret. It's not that we're never going to tell them, right? But we're rolling out a conversation. So it's helpful. If you can just, like I said, it'll be natural to share with your peers. Someone's going to ask you, hey, what'd they talk about, right? It's fine. I'm not saying you not to answer that question. I'm just saying look around, make sure it's the appropriate time to answer that question. And try to be as positive as you can. I mean, within, your feelings. That we really, I hope that you will trust our intent in this is to do right by you and to do right by the people we support. now we can chat. So this flyer, the piece of paper that I gave you, really, we use it in leadership as a way to form some conversations, to listen about sort of what are my concerns, what are my fears. If it takes all of us going all in to make this work, what would be my barrier to that? Or what do I love about this, right? So what I found when I was talking to the team in Southern Oregon is this was a lot and people just needed to process. So I think that's going to be different with different groups that we chat with. So I think that what I'd like you to do is just, at least for the rest of our team out there, hello rest of our team, I don't think we need to tape this part, because I like to give people just an opportunity to